The humid Florida heat, a palpable suffocating blanket pressed down on the meticulously manicured, unnervingly silent streets of Patriots Glen, an upscale, aggressively marketed gated community that billed itself with glossy brochures as an active adult living paradise. Dr. Lena Washington, Chief Counsel for the Federal Office of Health Rights and Access. Ara shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat of her nondescript rental car, the recycled air doing little to dispel the cloying oppressiveness of the late afternoon. She was here not in her official high-powered DC capacity, a role that saw her locking horns with corporate healthcare giants and intransigent state bureaucracies, but on a deeply personal and increasingly worrying clandestine mission. Her beloved uncle, Captain Robert Bob Miller, U.S. Navy, retired a decorated but now severely disabled Vietnam veteran, resided within these hallowed and apparently increasingly hostile gates. His increasingly frantic, fearful calls over the past few weeks, detailing a pattern of escalating targeted harassment by the HOA's private security force regarding his essential home health aide, Maria Sanchez, had prompted Lena to fly down from Washington under the guise of a long-overdue family visit. Her gut, honed by years of sniffing out injustice, told her something was deeply, dangerously wrong. As she pulled up to her uncle's modest, well-kept but aging bungalow, a stark architectural contrast to the sprawling, opulent new construction mini-mansions that now dominated the community. The scene that greeted her sent a jolt of cold, professional, and intensely personal outrage through her, confirming her worst fears. Two uniformed security guards from Glen Secure, the HOA's notoriously aggressive and frequently complained about security contractor, were physically brutally manhandling Maria Sanchez on Captain Miller's small front porch. Maria, a petite, compassionate woman in her late 20s, whose gentle demeanor belied a fierce dedication to her patients, and who was Captain Miller's highly skilled, state-certified, and absolutely indispensable home health aide, was being roughly, painfully handcuffed, her face a mask of bewildered terror and disbelief. Captain Miller himself, frail and wheelchair-bound, after a debilitating stroke that had cruelly followed years of insidious complications from Agent Orange exposure during his service, was shouting from his open doorway, his voice weak and reedy, but filled with a righteous, impotent fury that tore at Lena's heart. "Unhand her, you damn thugs, you bullies. She's my medical assistant. She has every right to be here. What in God's name do you think you're doing to her? This is an outrage." The lead guard, a hulking, steroid-puffed man, whose name tag, prominently displayed on his tactical vest, read Officer G. Thorne sneered dismissively at the elderly disabled veteran. "She's trespassing, old man, and soliciting, and creating a public disturbance. We've had numerous complaints from concerned residents. She's not authorized to be on Patriots Glen property without a current board-approved commercial vendor permit, which, surprise, surprise, she conveniently doesn't possess." He yanked Maria's arm with unnecessary sadistic force, causing her to cry out in pain. "You're coming with us, sweetheart. We'll sort this little misunderstanding out down at the HOA compliance office." His tone was laden with menace. A vendor permit for his life-sustaining medical care. Maria cried, her voice trembling, struggling instinctively uselessly against Thorne's brutal, bruising grip. "I'm his state-certified home health aide. I have all my credentials. I have a contract. Captain Miller needs his medication. He needs his afternoon therapy session. He needs me. He needs his meds now." "Rules are rules, lady." The other guard, younger, less overtly aggressive, but clearly nervous, and slavishly following Thorne's thuggish lead, parroted his eyes, avoiding Captain Miller's furious gaze. His name tag read Davis J. Lena Washington felt a cold, familiar, and deeply unwelcome anger rise within her, a focused rage she usually reserved for the most egregious cases of systemic injustice. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic snafu. This was a gross, calculated abuse of power. This was a blatant criminal violation of her uncle's fundamental human right to receive essential life-sustaining medical care in the sanctity of his own home. This was an illegal assault battery and false imprisonment of his dedicated, legally credentialed caregiver. She stepped out of her car, her movements economical, her expression hardening into the one that had made seasoned corporate lawyers, powerful lobbyists, and recalcitrant government officials quail in high-stakes negotiations and federal courtrooms. Officer Thorne, his nervous young partner, and the entire Patriots Glen HOA, under the notoriously iron-fisted autocratic rule of its long-reigning president, the infamous Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, were about to discover to their profound and lasting regret that they had just picked a monumental fight with precisely the wrong person. They had just assaulted and illegally detained the caregiver of a man whose niece literally wrote and fiercely enforced the federal laws they were so flagrantly, contemptuously violating. The chief counsel of the Federal Office of Health Rights and Access was on scene, and she was not pleased. She was in fact incandescent with a fury she hadn't felt in years. Dr. Lena Washington was one of the nation's foremost and arguably most feared legal experts on health rights patient advocacy, the intricate complexities of federal anti-discrimination laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, and the labyrinthine regulations governing Medicare and Medicaid. As chief counsel for the Office of Health Rights and Access, OHRA, a powerful, if often intentionally, behind-the-scenes enforcement and policy division within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. She spearheaded national enforcement actions against discriminatory practices, drafted critical patient protection policies, and frequently advised Congress and the White House on legislation designed to protect vulnerable patients and ensure equitable, unimpeded access to health care for all Americans. She was by reputation and by nature a force of nature. Brilliant, tenacious, fiercely articulate, and utterly implacably intolerant of those who sought to exploit abuse or corrupt the healthcare system, particularly at the expense of those most in need, those least able to fight for themselves. Her uncle Captain Bob Miller was her late mother's beloved stoic older brother, a man who had served his country with quiet, unassuming heroism through 3 decades in the U.S. Navy, including multiple combat tours in Vietnam. His post-retirement years, which should have been a time of well-earned peace and contentment, had been increasingly cruelly challenging, his strong body finally inexorably succumbing to the long-term insidious ravages of his wartime service, particularly his exposure to Agent Orange. His recent massive stroke had been devastating, leaving him partially paralyzed, entirely reliant on a specialized wheelchair and requiring round-the-clock, highly skilled nursing care for everything from complex medication management and intensive physical therapy to the most basic activities of daily living. Maria Sanchez, his dedicated home health aide, was by Captain Miller's own tearful admission to Lena a godsend, an angel of mercy. She was not just competent and compassionate. She was fiercely dedicated to Captain Miller's well-being, his dignity, his quality of life. She was not just an employee. She had, in the crucible of shared adversity, become like beloved family to the increasingly isolated veteran. Patriots Glen, the community where Captain Miller had bought his small, unassuming bungalow years ago, long before its current HOA regime, hoping for a peaceful, supportive retirement environment, had under the increasingly autocratic, almost dictatorial leadership of its current HOA president, Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, transformed into a suffocating battleground of petty, arbitrarily enforced rules, intrusive surveillance, and a pervasive atmosphere of intimidation. Mrs. Hayes, a wealthy, socially ambitious widow with far too much time on her hands, an unshakable, almost messianic belief in her own superior judgment, and a network of influential cronies on the HOA board, ran Patriots Glen like her own personal, tightly controlled fiefdom. She was by all accounts obsessed with maintaining Patriots Glen's exclusive image and skyrocketing property values, which in her narrow, prejudiced view were constantly threatened by anything or anyone that deviated from her rigid, anachronistic definition of appropriate residential living. This included, it had become increasingly painfully clear, the visible presence of disabled residents, their necessary medical equipment, and their essential caregivers. The inciting incident, the event that had first brought Mrs. Hayes's and Officer Thorne's particular venomous animosity towards Captain Miller and Maria Sanchez to Lena's official, albeit initially informal attention, had occurred approximately a month prior. Mrs. Hayes, during one of her frequent self-appointed community aesthetic and compliance patrols, conducted from her golf cart with the imperious air of a Roman empress surveying her domain, had observed Maria patiently, skillfully assisting Captain Miller with his prescribed physical therapy exercises on his small, enclosed, and entirely private back lanai. The lanai, while architecturally private, was unfortunately partially visible from a section of the adjacent HOA-owned Championship Golf Course fairway. Mrs. Hayes had immediately, and with great public fanfare at the next HOA meeting, lodged a formal multi-page HOA complaint citing a deliberately nebulous catch-all bylaw about unseemly, unsightly, or disruptive activities visible from common areas or impacting community enjoyment. She had further outrageously implied in her written complaint that the sight of Captain Miller's distressing physical therapy was upsetting to golfers, detrimental to the community's tranquil and upscale atmosphere, and negatively impacting the aesthetic harmony of Patriots Glen. She had demanded in no uncertain terms that all such private medical activities be conducted entirely indoors behind drawn curtains and completely out of public sight. Officer Thorne, clearly relishing the task, had been dispatched by Mrs. Hayes to deliver the official HOA warning notice, doing so with a smug, condescending, and overtly intimidating demeanor that had left both the proud Captain Miller and the gentle Maria feeling profoundly harassed, demeaned, and violated in their own home. Lena, upon hearing of this latest indignity from her furious, frustrated uncle, had initially advised him to meticulously document every interaction, to install security cameras, and to file a formal complaint with the State Licensing Board for Homeowners Associations. She had even, through discreet back channels within HHS, made an informal inquiry to the Regional Office for Civil Rights about Patriots Glen's compliance with federal fair housing laws and ADA regulations regarding reasonable accommodations for necessary medical care and caregivers. The rising action of the targeted harassment, however, had only intensified, becoming more blatant, more aggressive, more dangerous. First Officer Thorne, clearly acting with Mrs. Hayes' blessing, began to systematically, almost obsessively target Maria Sanchez's car, a reliable but older model sedan. He would issue her multiple expensive parking citations for being improperly parked in a designated guest space for more than the allotted 2 hours, even though she was clearly on duty providing essential round-the-clock medical care and had a state-issued, medically necessitated caregiver parking placard prominently displayed on her dashboard. When Maria, a naturally polite and non-confrontational young woman, attempted to explain her presence, her vital role, Thorne would become verbally abusive, dismissive, often shouting, threatening to have her car towed at her expense, or, more ominously, to have her permanent access to Patriots Glen revoked entirely. "You're just the help," he'd sneered at her on one occasion. "You don't make the rules here." The second and far more shocking and potentially life-threatening incident had involved a direct calculated attempt to interfere with Captain Miller's critical medical care. While one sweltering afternoon, a crucial, time-sensitive delivery of specialized life-sustaining medication for Captain Miller, medication that required constant refrigeration and precise, timely administration to prevent medical crisis, was summarily refused entry at the main Patriots Glen security gate by Officer Thorne himself. Thorne, citing a new, unannounced, and apparently entirely fabricated HOA policy requiring pre-clearance and an unobtainable special permit for all commercial and medical delivery vehicles, had arrogantly, callously turned the clearly marked refrigerated pharmacy delivery van away. Maria Sanchez had only discovered the catastrophic problem hours later, when the pharmacy concerned had called to inquire why the vital medication had been returned undelivered. It had taken frantic, desperate calls from Captain Miller's neurologist, a direct, furious intervention by a local veterans advocacy group, alerted by a frantic Lena from D.C., and the threatened emergency legal intervention by a pro bono law firm to finally get the medication delivered late that night, hours after it was due, putting Captain Miller's already fragile health at significant, unacceptable risk. Mrs. Hayes, when eventually confronted by a delegation of concerned residents and Captain Miller's doctor, had coolly, unapologetically stated that rules are rules regardless of circumstance, and that all vendors, without any exception, must strictly comply with Patriots Glen's stringent access protocols to ensure the absolute security and privacy of our residents. It was chillingly clear to Lena that Mrs. Hayes was either deliberately, systematically trying to make Captain Miller's continued residence in his own home untenable, perhaps to force him into a more expensive institution-like setting, or she was so profoundly criminally negligent in her understanding of medical necessity, disability rights, and basic human decency that she posed a clear and present danger to vulnerable residents. The midpoint twist, the critical revelation that deepened Lena's already grave suspicion that this escalating harassment was not just about petty HOA tyranny, aesthetic fascism, or even simple prejudice, but potentially involved a more organized, sophisticated, and perhaps even financially motivated corrupt agenda, came from a discreet, trusted source within the Florida State Department of Elder Affairs. An experienced investigator there, a former colleague whom Lena knew professionally and respected for her integrity, was quietly, cautiously looking into a disturbing pattern of similar complaints emerging from several upscale, continuing care retirement communities, CCRCs, and gated active adult communities across the state. These communities, like Patriots Glen, were increasingly being managed by aggressive, profit-driven HOAs and their private security forces, often with opaque financial structures and interlocking board memberships. The complaints involved serious allegations of systematic pressure being applied to elderly or disabled residents with high medical needs, residents like Captain Miller, to sell their often valuable properties, sometimes at below market rates, to HOA-connected entities, or to move into higher cost, often poorly regulated assisted living wings or memory care units that were frequently owned, operated, or managed by companies or individuals with close undisclosed ties to the HOA board members themselves. Patriots Glen, and specifically its domineering president, Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, and her well-documented suspiciously close ties to the primary developer of a new very expensive and aggressively marketed Azure Sky's premier assisted living and memory care facility being constructed just outside Patriots Glen's main gates, was squarely and very prominently on their investigative radar. Was Evelyn Hayes callously, criminally using Officer Thorne and the HOA bylaws as cudgels to systematically harass, intimidate, and ultimately drive out vulnerable residents like Captain Miller, whose ongoing complex and unsightly medical needs were seen as a drain on resources, a blight on the community's image, or an inconvenient obstacle to her grand vision of a more profitable, marketable, and uniformly healthy community demographic? Was she trying to free up his desirable centrally located bungalow for a quick, lucrative resale to a healthier, wealthier, and less problematic buyer, perhaps with a kickback involved? The pieces were falling into a sickening, corrupt pattern. A potential and cleverly deployed red herring had briefly surfaced a few weeks earlier when a local newspaper known for its sensationalist reporting ran a prominent fear-mongering story about a supposed rise in petty crime daytime burglaries and prescription drug theft, specifically targeting elderly residents in several nearby, less affluent communities entirely unrelated to Patriots Glen. Mrs. Hayes had immediately and very publicly seized upon this story, distributing copies at HOA meetings, posting alarmed bulletins, and using it as potent justification for demanding even stricter security measures at Patriots Glen, more aggressive, intrusive patrolling by Officer Thorne and his Glen Secure minions, and further draconian restrictions on all non-resident access, including by clear and chilling implication, essential caregivers like Maria Sanchez. It was a shrewd, cynical way to manufacture an atmosphere of fear and anxiety to justify her increasingly authoritarian tactics and inflated security budgets, while simultaneously deflecting attention from her own potential malfeasance and the real internal threats to resident well-being. Lena had been in the painstaking process of compiling a comprehensive damning dossier of evidence: witness statements, medical records, HOA documents, financial analyses, preparing to escalate the entire matter through official DOJ Civil Rights Division and HHS Office of Inspector General channels when her uncle's increasingly distressed, almost desperate calls about Thorne's daily escalating harassment of Maria and the palpable, terrifying feeling that something was about to break, that Maria or her uncle were in imminent danger, had prompted her to drop everything and fly down to Florida immediately. She had arrived at Patriots Glen unannounced, just in time to witness Officer Thorne's thuggish, arrogant overreach firsthand, his illegal, brutal detention of Maria Sanchez, a blatant, undeniable, and utterly inexcusable act of aggression, a profound violation of her uncle's fundamental federally protected right to receive essential care in his own home. The gloves, Lena decided with a cold, hard certainty, were now well and truly and irrevocably off. Officer Thorne. Lena Washington said, her voice resonating with a calm, unshakable, steely authority that seemed to suck the very air out of the humid Florida afternoon, instantly cutting through his blustering, self-important pronouncements. "You are, as we speak, currently engaged in the illegal arrest and false imprisonment of Ms. Maria Sanchez, a state-certified, legally credentialed home health aide. You are also actively and with apparent malicious intent obstructing the provision of essential life-sustaining medical care to Captain Robert Miller, a severely disabled United States veteran, in his own home. Both of these actions constitute serious prosecutable violations of numerous state and federal laws, including but not limited to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Potentially Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code regarding the willful deprivation of rights under color of law, and numerous Florida state statutes pertaining to patient rights, caregiver protections, and false imprisonment." Thorne, who had been puffing out his chest like a bantam rooster, clearly expecting Lena to be intimidated by his uniform, his badge, his aggressive posture, and his sheer physical bulk, now looked momentarily visibly stunned. His jaw actually dropped. He clearly hadn't anticipated a detailed impromptu lecture on complex federal and state statutes from an articulate, impeccably dressed civilian bystander. "Now you just see here, lady." He began, his face flushing a deeper, angrier shade of crimson, his voice laced with disbelief and a renewed surge of belligerence. "I don't know who the hell you think you are barging in here, but I'm a sworn security officer of Patriots Glen Security, a licensed and bonded agency, and I have a sworn duty to enforce HOA bylaws and maintain order in this community. This woman," he gestured contemptuously with his cuffed hand towards the now tearful but increasingly defiant Maria, "is an unauthorized commercial solicitor. She has no valid board-approved vendor permit, she's trespassing on private property, and she's causing a disturbance. Case closed." "A vendor permit?" Lena's eyebrows arched in mock surprise. "For a state-certified licensed medical professional providing essential life-sustaining physician-prescribed healthcare services to a legal resident in his own home, that is on its face an absurd, discriminatory, and patently illegal requirement, officer. And Ms. Sanchez is most certainly not soliciting. She is professionally employed under contract by Captain Miller to provide critical care. She is not trespassing. She is a lawful invitee absolutely essential to his health, his safety, and his well-being." She reached into her briefcase, which she had retrieved from her car, and produced her own official credentials, the impressive gold-embossed shield of her federal office and her official photo identification. "I am Dr. Lena Washington, Chief Counsel for the United States Office of Health Rights and Access, a division of the Department of Health and Human Services. My office, Officer Thorne, is directly responsible for investigating and prosecuting violations of federal laws that protect patient rights and ensure unimpeded access to health care. And you, Officer Thorne, by your actions here today, are currently committing multiple serious and flagrant violations of those very laws. Release her, Thorne, or face federal charges. Now." The transformation in Thorne's demeanor was as dramatic as it was instantaneous. The aggressive, condescending bluster drained away, replaced by a slack-jawed, almost comical disbelief, which quickly morphed into a dawning, palpable, almost pitiable fear. The younger guard, Davis, who had been hovering uncertainly in the background, looking increasingly uncomfortable, now looked like he genuinely wanted to disappear into the pristine, freshly painted stucco of Captain Miller's bungalow. "Sarge," Davis whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sarge, maybe we should... This is bad. This is really bad. This is wrong." Captain Miller, from his wheelchair in the doorway, managed a weak but distinctly triumphant, "Damn right it is, son. Give 'em hell, Lena. Give 'em hell for all of us." Just then, as if summoned by the escalating drama, Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, the formidable HOA president herself, arrived in her silent chauffeured electric golf cart, its expensive chrome gleaming in the harsh sunlight. She took in the tense, altered scene, Lena's imposing, commanding presence, Thorne's sudden, remarkable deflation, Maria Sanchez still in handcuffs, but now looking more defiant and hopeful than terrified, the younger guard looking mutinous, and her perfectly coiffed, surgically tightened face constricted into a mask of intense displeasure and regal annoyance. "What is the meaning of this unseemly disturbance?" Mrs. Hayes demanded, her voice sharp, imperious, accustomed to instant obedience. Officer Thorne, why is this person still on the premises? I thought I made it abundantly clear that all unauthorized personnel, particularly those causing disruptions, were to be removed from Patriots Glen property immediately and without further discussion. She fixed Maria with a look of utter contempt. You'll regret crossing me, Washington. This is my community. Mrs. Hayes, Lena said, turning her cool, appraising, and utterly unintimidated gaze on the HOA president. I am Dr. Lena Washington, Chief Counsel for the Federal Office of Health Rights and Access. Your security officer, Mr. Thorne, acting under your apparent direction and in accordance with your HOA's discriminatory policies, has just illegally detained and physically assaulted Ms. Maria Sanchez, Captain Miller's state-certified essential home health aide. In doing so, he has also actively and with apparent malicious intent obstructed Captain Miller's fundamental right to receive essential life-sustaining medical care in his own home. These actions, Mrs. Hayes, constitute serious federal offenses. Furthermore, your HOA's stated policy of requiring vendor permits for accredited licensed medical caregivers providing services to residents is on its face a clear, unambiguous, and actionable violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and multiple federal fair housing laws. Mrs. Hayes's eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual disapproval, widened momentarily in surprise, but she quickly recovered her formidable composure, her expression hardening into one of stubborn, arrogant defiance. Federal, she scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. This is a private, exclusive community, Dr. Washington. We have our own rules, our own meticulously crafted standards designed to protect our residents and our property values. We will not have our tranquility, our aesthetic harmony disrupted by a constant, unsightly parade of outside personnel, unfamiliar vehicles, and frankly, depressing medical paraphernalia. Captain Miller, while a respected veteran and a long-term resident, must understand that living in Patriots Glen requires a certain level of adherence to our community's established aesthetic and procedural norms. If his extensive medical needs are now too burdensome, too disruptive for our community standards, then perhaps regrettably he should consider relocating to a more specialized and appropriate facility. Azure Skies, for instance, is opening just down the road. I hear it's lovely. She had, in fact, not just heard it was lovely. She had a vested, hidden financial interest in its success, having previously promised Captain Miller she'd look into ways to help him stay in his home, a promise she'd callously broken when the Azure Skies deal became more lucrative. Her callous, discriminatory, and chillingly utilitarian words, her utter breathtaking disregard for her uncle's dignity, his service, his fundamental human right to receive necessary care in his own home, ignited a cold, righteous fury in Lena, a fury she channeled into an icy, precise resolve. Mrs. Hayes, Lena said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, almost silken tone that was far more menacing than any shout. Your aesthetic norms do not and will never supersede federal law. Your community standards do not and will never grant you the right to endanger the life of a disabled veteran or to systematically harass and intimidate his essential caregivers. Your actions and the actions of Officer Thorne and Glen Secure, apparently under your direct or indirect instruction, are not just profoundly discriminatory, Mrs. Hayes. They are potentially, and I would argue demonstrably, criminal. As of this moment, my office will be launching a full, comprehensive, and unsparing federal investigation into the practices of the Patriots Glen HOA, your security contractor, Glen Secure Solutions, your personal conduct in this and other related matters, and your financial ties to entities like Azure Skies. You can expect federal subpoenas, exhaustive audits, and very possibly federal criminal charges. Just as Hayes began to sputter a furious denial, a new voice, firm and laced with indignation, joined the fray. She's right. Hayes is profiting from pushing us out. It's all a sham. An elderly man, a distinguished-looking resident Lena recognized from photos as a retired judge, and a friend of her uncle, stepped forward from a small group of neighbors who had gathered holding a sheaf of papers. I'm Judge Harrison, Mrs. Hayes, and I have here documented proof of your secret deal with Azure Skies and your systematic campaign to force out residents with high medical needs. It's all lies. You're concerned for standards. It's about money. He waved the papers. "This needs to stop." Hayes stared at him, her face a mask of fury and sudden stark terror. "It's all lies," she shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "He's a senile old fool. Thorne, get these people off my property." Lena ignored her. She turned to the now trembling, sweating Officer Thorne. "Officer Thorne, you are to release Ms. Sanchez from these unlawful restraints immediately. You will then provide your full name, badge number, and the direct contact information for your immediate supervisor at Glen Secured, my associate." She gestured to a junior attorney from her Ochara office who had accompanied her to Florida and had just arrived on scene, already discreetly filming the interaction on her secure government tablet and taking meticulous notes. "You are to have absolutely no further contact, direct or indirect, with Captain Miller or Ms. Sanchez. Your conduct today and your prior actions will be immediately reported to the State Licensing Board for security personnel, and I will personally ensure that you and any and all complicit parties are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Thorne, fumbling with the handcuff key, his hands shaking violently, finally managed to unlock the cuffs from Maria's bruised, reddened wrists. Maria rubbed her sore skin, her eyes, though still shadowed with fear, and the trauma of the assault now holding a spark of dawning hope, a flicker of fight. Davis, the younger guard, looked utterly miserable and whispered another apology to Maria. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't know. He said you needed this." The subsequent federal investigation, spearheaded by Lena Washington's office with a relentless, unwavering focus, was as swift as it was unsparing. It quickly uncovered a systemic, deeply ingrained pattern of discrimination, harassment, and financial exploitation within Patriots Glen, all meticulously orchestrated by Mrs. Hayes and brutally executed by Glen Secure, specifically aimed at pressuring elderly and disabled residents with significant ongoing medical needs to either severely curtail their essential care, sell their homes often to Hayes-connected entities at below-market prices, or leave the community entirely. The vendor permit for caregivers was indeed an illegal discriminatory invention of Mrs. Hayes designed as a potent tool for intimidation and control. Officer Thorne's personnel file, once subpoenaed from Glen Secure's reluctant corporate office, revealed a disturbing consistent history of similar complaints for excessive force harassment and abuse of authority in other communities, all previously ignored, dismissed, or quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements by Glen Secure's aggressive legal team. The intricate, deliberately obscured financial links between Mrs. Hayes, several key HOA board members, and the primary developer of the Azure Skies premier assisted living facility, the facility she so often so helpfully suggested as an alternative for residents like Captain Miller, were also meticulously, damningly exposed, revealing a clear predatory and illegal financial motive behind her discriminatory, inhumane actions. Judge Harrison's documents proved invaluable. Officer Gary Thorne was arrested and charged with multiple federal and state offenses, including felony deprivation of rights under color of law assault and battery false imprisonment and intimidation of a witness. Faced with overwhelming, irrefutable evidence, including Lena Washington's own powerful testimony, Officer Davis's corroborating statement given in exchange for a lesser charge, and damning audio and video recordings Maria Sanchez had courageously discreetly made of some of his earlier threats and abusive encounters, Thorne eventually reluctantly pled guilty to several charges and received a significant federal prison sentence, his career in any form of security or law enforcement permanently justly over. Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, her carefully constructed reputation in tatters, her social standing annihilated, was indicted on a slew of serious federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, honest services, wire fraud related to the illicit kickbacks from the Azure Skies, developer bribery, and obstruction of justice. She and several of her most complicit HOA board cronies were forced to resign in disgrace. The Patriots Glen HOA was placed under a stringent, long-term federal consent decree mandating sweeping top-to-bottom reforms to its bylaws, governance, financial transparency, and security practices, all to be rigorously overseen by Lena's office at OHRA and a court-appointed special master. Glen Secure Solutions. Its corrupt practices, exposed to the harsh light of federal scrutiny, lost its state operating license and was hit with crippling federal fines, multiple civil lawsuits from victimized residents across several states, and eventually declared bankruptcy, its predatory operations effectively permanently dismantled. Captain Bob Miller, with the gentle, dedicated, and now entirely unimpeded care of Maria Sanchez, once again fully restored, saw his health, his spirits, and his quality of life improve significantly, almost miraculously. He became an unexpected, quietly eloquent, and incredibly powerful advocate for the rights of disabled veterans, the elderly, and all patients needing essential home health care. His quiet dignity, his unwavering testimony, and his simple, profound story, a powerful rebuke to the prejudice, greed, and abuse he had endured. He even started a support group within Patriots Glen for other residents who had suffered under Hayes's reign. Maria, no longer living in fear, continued to care for him, their bond strengthened by the shared ordeal. Other residents, like the brave Judge Harrison, stepped up to help reform their community from within. Dr. Lena Washington, deeply affected by her uncle's plight and the systemic injustices it represented, used the Patriots Glen case as a national catalyst for much-needed change. Captain Miller's Law, a comprehensive landmark piece of federal legislation, was meticulously drafted and fiercely championed by her office with strong bipartisan support, forged through relentless advocacy and the power of her uncle's story. It strengthened existing legal protections for individuals receiving home health care, clarified and expanded the rights of caregivers, mandated stringent ADA and patient rights training for all private security personnel operating in residential communities receiving any form of federal funding, and established severe escalating federal penalties for HOAs, management companies, or individuals who attempt to obstruct, interfere with, or otherwise create barriers to essential medical care. The law also created a new well-funded federal task force housed within HHS and DOJ, specifically to investigate and prosecute discriminatory housing practices and financial exploitation targeting individuals with disabilities or significant medical needs. The passage of Captain Miller's Law was a monumental, hard-fought victory for health rights, disability advocacy, and patient protection nationwide. Lena Washington, standing beside her visibly emotional uncle and a beaming Maria Sanchez in the White House Rose Garden as the president signed the bill into law, felt a profound, weary, but deeply satisfying sense of accomplishment. The fight against ignorance, entrenched prejudice, systemic corruption, and corporate greed was an ongoing, never-ending one, she knew. There would always be new battles, new injustices to confront. But today, for her uncle, for Maria, for countless others whose names she would never know, justice had prevailed. The quiet, unassuming courage of one disabled veteran and his dedicated, compassionate caregiver, amplified by the unwavering, formidable resolve of a federal attorney who believed fiercely, passionately in her mission, had not only exposed and dismantled a local injustice, but had forged a new, stronger shield of protection for countless vulnerable Americans across the entire country. The tranquility of communities like Patriots Glen, Lena thought with a small, tired smile as Captain Miller squeezed her hand and whispered, "You did it, kid. Your mom would be so proud," would henceforth be measured not by the absence of unsightly medical equipment or the forced invisibility of those needing care, but by the presence of compassion, respect, inclusivity, and the unassailable fundamental right of every individual to live with dignity, safety, and receive the care they need in their own homes, in their own communities, unmolested and unafraid.